the pigeon with the charred orange, and the biscuits with the chicken liver.
Chicken liver.
Okay. And here you have sage, wheat breads, brain.
Our next adventure was to drive the rented car out to the wineries in Tuscany and to visit the towns there. The planned itinerary of our first day was to drive from Florence to the winery and then have lunch at the restaurant nearby, and then drive off to San Gimignano and then to another winery, then going to our accommodation for the night. The first winery we went to was Marchesi Antinori. One of the biggest features of this winery was its architecture and its contemporary design. This is the rooftop vineyard. Unfortunately, we went in a season when it was not warm enough, but during the summer season, I believe it would be really beautiful there. We actually didn't know until this wine tour and wine tasting that this winery has such a long history and it owns so many different brands around the world, specifically Italy, but in many different regions. It was shocking to us that one of the wine brands was at where we were about to go for lunch. So after a tasting and after a few more shots, we were ready to head over to lunch. I didn't get any shots of the parking spaces, but the scale of this winery was actually big enough that the whole floor was for parking, and they actually had parking attendants as well.
好有型喎！
Here's a good shot of the Fiat we rented and the surrounding of the restaurant we went to for lunch. This restaurant was actually a 1-star Michelin restaurant in 2021, so we ordered the tasting menu for both of us. I also strongly believe Antinori actually owns this restaurant, so this phone book thick drink menu was containing basically all of their wine brands.
Oh,
可以開車啦，停喺度就停喺度，你真係扮啊！你真係停喺度，你唔係扮嘅，你真係停喺度。
因為過咗呢段就冇石啦嘛，過咗就冇啦。
出面呢度都幾靚呢度。
Then the rain caught up to us, and look at how windy the roads were at Tuscany. This was basically our drive for the next hour or so. Our next stop was San Gimignano, but the rain only got worse when we got there, and I couldn't quite figure out the parking situation, so we just took a few photos and left. We'll just have to go back to visit on another trip. And more non-ideal driving conditions later, we got to Castello di Ama. Obviously, we picked a bad day to visit the winery, and the touring season hasn't really started yet. But just imagine it's the summer season, and the whole drive in, you're surrounded by all these greeneries and vineyards. I can imagine it being beautiful. So Castello di Ama is definitely one of the wineries I really look forward to coming back to visit during peak season. So this is how the surrounding is supposed to look on a nice sunny day. But this is actually what we got the day we got there. It took us a little bit of getting lost and walking around in the rain to find the actual location of the restaurant, but when we got there, we got the best service from the server. We were actually the only customers for their night, and we still got really good service regardless, and they didn't deny our reservation. So we were really happy with the experience. The food was just decent, nothing surprising, but we had a good experience there. By the time our dinner was done, it was already really dark out, so at that point we were just trying to get to our hotel as soon as we could. Just a little comment about my driving experience in Tuscany. I think if you have experienced driving out to the mountains for hiking or skiing or snowboarding, then you would be totally fine. It's just a little annoying doing so many turns for an hour or so for each stops that you're making, but it's not completely terrible. And this quote-unquote hotel that we stayed at was very near Siena. That's the reason we picked it, but in my opinion, it was still pretty expensive. It would basically be expensive everywhere you look in Tuscany. The photos from the booking looked really nice, but in my opinion, everything was really old and the room was very small for the price, but at least the bathroom was clean, so I was happy about that. You can't really get a really good view of Siena, but at least you can see it, so that's good enough for us for one night. About getting into Siena, you actually can't park inside the walls of these old towns, so you have to find a parkade outside the town and then walk up. But they do have an escalator available if you want to take it instead of walking. But we later found out on our way down that it's really not that far of a walk. To me, Siena is a very nice and relaxing medieval style town. We didn't get to spend too much time inside the walls, but we still got a chance to walk through the streets and to visit a few of the famous attractions. I would definitely recommend a day trip there. It was a very nice afternoon that we spent at Siena. So this is Piazza del Campo. This is used for horse racing even to this day. So basically, the horses would race around the central plaza, and the audiences would be watching the race all around from high up and from the stands. For some reason, during our trip in Italy, all these kids were having school trips, so we were seeing different ages of them everywhere, and they were really loud. One of our highlights in Siena was having great food at this restaurant. This is the Michelin Guide restaurant in 2021, and this is what we thought of it.
This is the macaron
Yes.
with the chicken liver pate and cacao. In the middle is chickpeas with anchovies mayo. And the last one is a fake lasagnetta. So it's a puff pastry, ragu, and parmesan cheese on top, and basil.
Great.
And our homemade bread, focaccia with the latte di colonnata, baguette with wheat flour, and different flour on a big bread. And our homemade recipe. Tongue with fresh shrimps and green celery mayo.
Yes, please.
The pigeon with the charred orange and the biscuits with the chicken liver. Okay. And here you have sage, sweetbreads, grain, artichokes, and chicken. Okay. I suggest you this is a ginger broth. You can try after a piece or dip in the inside. Okay.
Okay,
Enjoy.
great thing.
Tutto pasticceria. Okay?
Yeah.
Our next stop and last stop before leaving the Chianti region was visiting this winery at the top of the mountains. It had fantastic view looking back down. This castle also has a long history dating back to the 7th century, so it was really interesting to walk through the property while learning about the wines they had at the winery. And of course, we got another set of wines to taste after our walkthrough at the estate. They also, not very generously, gave us a few drops of their precious aged balsamic vinegar to taste. These were very precious and valuable to them because they could only produce a very small quantity every year and they have to be stored behind locked doors.
好味，好味，即係醋本身好味。
So I got my souvenir from there and took a few more scenic shots before we left the winery. Since we rented a convertible Fiat and we couldn't take any photos the day before, we were taking plenty today before we had to return the car. And of course, taking advantage of having a rented car, we went to the top of Florence to take some scenic shots as well before we had to drive back to return it. The only scam we experienced in our whole trip was at this shady gas pump. If you want to know more about it, ask us directly.